Therefore, floating the currency did not solve the balance of payments problem. It just shifted responsibility for financing those additional imports from the banking sector to the non-banking sectors of the economy. The banks were no longer responsible for the consequences of their own lending. Instead, the private non-bank sector was made responsible. Hi, in this video I'm explaining the effect of using the exchange rate to balance international payments and receipts. I'm Lee Harkness. In my previous video I explained how the growth of bank lending caused balance of payments problems in the Kingdom of Tonga. We then put in policies to manage the growth of bank credit so as to control the balance of payments. While the bank initially opposed those policies, it accepted them when it realised that the growth of bank lending was causing a reduction in foreign reserves. In July 1984, I joined the Australian Treasury. The Australian economy had experienced serious balance of payments problems in the previous year, and in December 1983, against the advice of the Treasury, the government floated the Australian dollar. Even so, Australia continued to experience current account deficits. My experience in Tonga led me to consider whether these deficits were caused by the growth of bank credit. When I compared the growth of bank lending to the current account deficit in Australia, I found that they were roughly equal. This was a stronger relationship than I had found in Tonga. The bank credit and currency shown in this chart includes money in the form of notes and coins. The Australian government sold notes and coins to the banks and treated the proceeds of those sales as revenue. Hence, government spending, financed by the issue of notes and coins, increased the money supply. Also, the bank credit and currency chart includes the off-balance sheet loans of the banks, such as bank acceptances. These are bank-guaranteed securities issued by non-bank entities. These could be used by businesses to settle debts. Therefore, as far as the economy is concerned, they were a form of money. Excluded from the chart is money created through international transactions, which did occur at times despite the float. Also, an adjustment was made for the growth of bank capital. Bank capital is a form of savings. Hence, bank lending that was offset by the growth of bank capital did not contribute to the current account deficit. There were, and still are, economists who attribute the current account deficit to the federal government's fiscal deficits. This chart compares the accumulated fiscal deficits with the accumulated current account deficits, and they are obviously not related. Of course, if the government borrowed from the banks to fund its deficits, it would contribute to the current account deficit. However, the fiscal deficits is not directly related to the current account deficit. If it were, the fiscal surpluses, shown as falling accumulated fiscal deficits, would have caused current account surpluses. Between 2007 and 2009, you can see some large increases in the growth of bank credit and currency, without a corresponding rise in the current account deficit. There was a financial crisis in 2007, and it is likely that the Reserve Bank took measures to protect the banks at that time. Such intervention may have increased the money supply in a manner that did not affect domestic demand and the current account deficit. This new chart is the same as the previous one, except that it uses a logarithmic scale. For clarity, we will remove the chart of the accumulated fiscal deficits. In this chart, you can see that the accumulated current account deficits is shown as equal to the money supply in December 1983. Also, it shows that the current account deficit before December 1983 was growing faster than the money supply. That is because, under the fixed exchange rate system that applied before December 1983, the money spent on imports would have been removed from the money supply when it was converted into foreign currency to pay for the imports. That is, the rapid growth in bank lending at that time was leaking out of the economy and out of the money supply and generating large current account deficits. After the currency was floated, the only source of monetary growth was from the growth of bank credit, Now the money created by the banks was trapped inside the economy. International receipts and payments were now required to be equal. They no longer contributed to, nor took away from, the money supply, nor did they affect the foreign currency reserves. The official foreign currency reserves were no longer used, therefore they were as good as balanced. Even so, current receipts, such as export incomes, continued to be insufficient to pay for imports and other foreign currency commitments. The country could no longer use foreign reserves to pay for those imports in excess of exports. It now relied on private sector capital transactions to balance international payments. Therefore, floating the currency did not solve the balance of payments problem. It just shifted responsibility for financing those additional imports from the banking sector to the non-banking sectors of the economy. The banks were no longer responsible for the consequences of their own lending. Instead, the private non-bank sector was made responsible. I found similar relationships in countries such as New Zealand, the Philippines, India, and the United States of America. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand used to publish a series of statistics on the amount of money sourced from bank credit. It was called M3R. The bank described it as lending funded only from residents. It was the same as the M3 money supply, less funding from non-residents. The growth in that series is plotted in this chart from March 1988 to October 2010. The next chart plots the accumulated current account deficit for New Zealand over the same period, a period when the floating exchange rate system applied. This chart puts the two series together so that we can compare them. Over this period of more than 22 years, the accumulated current account deficit is roughly equal to the growth in bank credit. Both sets of figures are denominated in New Zealand dollars. The relationship between bank credit and the current account deficit takes the form of an identity. That is, it is not a behavioural relationship. While many economists, even in New Zealand, would attribute the current account deficit to the exchange rate or to the fiscal deficit, you can see that in this case, over these 22 years, there's not much room to attribute the current account balance to more than the growth of M3R, or what the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has called domestically funded bank credit. This chart plots the growth in bank lending for housing, personal consumption and business, together with the accumulated current account deficit for 2023 and the first half of 2024. While these are raw numbers, they indicate that the relationship between bank credit and the current account deficit is continuing today in New Zealand. I was passing through Manila in 1994 and went to the Central Bank of the Philippines to gather the data shown in this chart. The information was recorded in large bound books, and I had to transcribe the data from those books onto a laptop computer. Also, the current account data was recorded in US dollars, and I had to use the exchange rate data to convert the figures back to pesos. In this period of 10 years, there's a clear and strong relationship between the growth of commercial bank credit and the current account deficit in the Philippines. The information presented in this chart comes from the Reserve Bank of India's website. Instead of bank lending, I've used the Reserve Bank of India's statistics for the growth of currency in circulation. At first glance, it would appear that this data undermines the hypothesis that the growth of bank credit determines the current account balance. Yet for the first 10 years, from 1990 to 2000, the data is consistent with the results for Australia, New Zealand and the Philippines. The current account deficit was equal to the growth of bank credit, or in this case, the money in circulation. However, from the year 2000 to 2004, the Indian economy experienced current account surpluses, shown on this chart as a fall in the accumulated current account deficits. After further investigation, I learned that India had fixed its exchange rate between the year 2000 and 2004. The government had decided that the economy needed a breather from the stress caused by the floating exchange rate system. Once the economy had recovered, India resumed floating its currency. It was while the exchange rate was fixed that the Indian economy experienced current account surpluses. This tells us that India did not need to float its currency to balance its international payments and receipts. Also, it shows that returning from the fixed to the floating exchange rate system caused the economy to go from current account surpluses to current account deficits. To clarify the effects of the float in our chart, the accumulated current account deficit line has been rebased from June 2004 to bring it up to the level of the currency in circulation at that time. We can now see that up until 2010, the current account deficit resumed growing together with the growth of the currency in circulation. For further clarity in the chart, at June 2004, I have discontinued the previous accumulated current account deficit line. We can clearly see that from 2010, the current account deficit started growing faster than the currency in circulation. It would appear that the commercial banks may have found a way to lend money in a manner that was not included in the Reserve Bank of India's definition of currency in circulation. It was that lending that would have further raised demand above income, thereby raising the current account deficit above the growth of the official currency in circulation. To compare the growth of bank credit and the current account deficit in the United States of America, I define the growth of bank credit as comprising the total assets of all the commercial banks, that is, the statistics on gross loans and investments. Remember that loans are assets in a bank's books. To avoid double counting, I deducted the bank's liabilities to other banks and interbank loans. They would be equal to the bank's assets with other banks and assets in the form of loans to other banks. We are interested only in the money in the USA, though I deducted liabilities to related foreign offices. This chart compares the growth in bank credit to the accumulated current account deficit for the USA. We can see that initially the accumulated current account deficit follows the growth in bank credit. Then, in 1991, we see a sudden divergence. There was a recession and the savings and loans collapse around that time. There were attempts to rescue savings and loans associations, and that could have shifted their assets and liabilities from the non-bank to the banking sector, causing that sudden rise in bank assets shown in our chart. To adjust for these, I have modified the chart by excluding any growth in bank assets in 1991 and resumed plotting the growth from 1992, as shown here. This shows that since 1991, the relationship between the growth of bank credit and the accumulated current account deficit has roughly resembled the relationship we found in Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines and India. That is, the current account deficit is equal to the growth of bank credit. In this chart, I have added a line for the fiscal deficit. We can see that the fiscal deficit is not related to the current account deficit. Periods of fiscal surpluses, shown as falls in the accumulated fiscal deficits, are not translated into falls in the accumulated current account deficits. Current account deficits continue to rise despite the fiscal surpluses. There are countries such as Japan that have not shared the same experience of the current account deficit being equal to the growth of bank credit. At times, they have experienced current account surpluses. Japan has had large investment flows out of the country that deflated the currency, contracting the demand for imports and expanding the supply of exports to bring about current account surpluses. Even Australia has experienced current account surpluses between 2019 and 2023, possibly due to the rise of domestic investment offshore and a reduction of foreign investment. Using the exchange rate to balance international payments and receipts has balanced receipts and payments on the foreign exchange market. But floating exchange rates did not bring about a current account balance. If anything, as we saw in the case of India, it may have worsened the balance. What the floating exchange rate system did do was shift responsibility for balancing international receipts and payments from the banking sector to the non-bank sector. In the countries I examined, the consequences of using the exchange rate to address a balance of payments problem caused the economy to go into debt or sell off the farm to pay for the excess imports. Flexible or floating exchange rates addressed one symptom of the imbalance, that is, the availability of funds to pay for the excess imports. However, they did not address the problem of excess demand and allowed it to continue. Also, it changed the exchange rate and the effect of international trade on the economy. That has had repercussions for other sectors of the economy. I'll look at those issues in later videos.